This video is sponsored by Enlisted. All world leaders, especially American presidents, have their legacies. Some of these are either good or bad, but nearly all can be balanced out by examining both the positive and negative impacts of their administrations. Few presidents have stirred as much controversy as Richard M. Nixon and Lyndon B. Johnson. Nixon succeeded the presidency after Johnson and inherited the Vietnam War and a severely divided nation. Who was Richard Milhous Nixon? What did he do that left both positive and negative impacts upon American society? And how effective was he on the national and global stage? Hello, I'm Colin D, military veteran, historian, and author, and today on Forgotten History, in our series of Most Corrupt, we will cover Richard M. Nixon. Richard Milhous Nixon was born on January 9, 1913 in Yorba Linda, California. He was the second of 5 children. His father, Frank Nixon, owned a service station and grocery store. His mother, Hannah Milhous Nixon, was a devout Quaker and was a great influence on her children. The family moved to Whittier in 1922. Nixon was third in his high school class and was offered admission and a tuition grant to Harvard. But he was needed at home by his family due to their struggles during the Great Depression, so he attended a local school. He did well and graduated second in his class from Whittier College in California in 1934 and third in his class from Duke University Law School in Durham, North Carolina in 1937. Nixon had applied to the FBI, but he never heard back about his application. He learned years later that he had been accepted, but budget cuts under Franklin Roosevelt eliminated his opportunity for a position. He returned to Whittier to practice law and met Thelma Catherine Pat Ryan, who was a teacher and amateur actress. They met when they were both cast in the same play at a local community theater and were married in 1940. In August 1942, after briefly working in the Office of Price Administration in Washington, D.C., Nixon joined the U.S. Navy and served as an aviation ground logistics officer in the Pacific and rising to the rank of lieutenant commander. Following his return to civilian life after the war, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1946, defeating the 5-term Liberal Democratic Congressman Jerry Voorhees in a campaign that relied heavily on exploiting the rumors that Voorhees was a communist sympathizer, like many in the former FDR administration. Nixon ran for re-election in 1948 and won both the Democratic and Republican primaries, which eliminated the need for him to participate in the general election. As a result of the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1948 to 1950, he took a leading role in the investigation of former State Department official Alger Hiss, who was accused of spying for the Soviet Union. In dramatic testimony before the committee, journalist and former spy Whittaker Chambers claimed that in 1937, Hiss had given him classified State Department papers for transmission to a Soviet agent. During these proceedings, Nixon became nationally known as a dedicated anti-communist. Hiss denied the charge, but he was later convicted of perjury when the documents were brought forward. Enlisted is a World War II multiplayer shooter game that has a strong focus on historical authenticity while keeping gameplay dynamic, players always in the middle of the action. What I personally love about Enlisted is that it features hundreds of firearms and specialized weapons, from common weapons seen throughout the war to various prototypes rarely portrayed in games. You can also join the battle as a ground vehicle crew or aircraft pilot with an increasing arsenal of armored cars, tanks, fighters, bombers, and other vehicles. Enlisted is available on PC, Xbox, and PlayStation with cross-platform support. There is no purchase necessary. Simply follow the link to download and play for free now. So, join me on the Enlisted battlefield. Follow my link to get to the game, as well as an exclusive bonus which includes 3 days of premium time and several orders for troops and weapons. Thank you for supporting the channel. In 1950, Nixon ran for the United States Senate against Democratic-Republican Helen Gahagan Douglas. In a very wily maneuver, his campaign distributed pink sheets, comparing Douglas's voting record to that of Vito Marcantonio, who was a well-known left-wing congressional representative from New York. As a result of this masterstroke, the Independent Review, a small Southern California newspaper, gave him the nickname Tricky Dick, which would become a sobriquet for his political opponents. Nixon won the nomination for vice president at the Republican convention in 1952 on a ticket with former U.S. Army General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Republicans saw Nixon as the most viable candidate because of his anti-communist credentials and that he would draw valuable supporters in the West. During the campaign, the New York Post reported that Nixon had a secret slush fund provided by contributions from a group of Southern California businessmen. Eisenhower was willing to give Nixon a chance to clear himself, but emphasized that Nixon needed to emerge from the crisis as clean as a houndstooth. Nixon delivered a nationally televised address on September 23, 1952, in what became known as the Checkers speech, where he acknowledged the existence of the fund but denied that any of it had been used inappropriately. In order to prove his point that he had not misused the money for personal gain, he listed his family's entire financial assets and liabilities in exacting detail. He submitted IRS tax statements and took a jab at the wealthy Democrats by stating that his wife, Pat, unlike the wives of so many Democratic politicians, did not own a fur coat, but only a respectable Republican cloth coat. He did admit to receiving one gift that was not disclosed on his taxes, which was a Cocker Spaniel puppy that his 6-year-old daughter, Tricia, had named Checkers. Regardless of what they say about it, he declared, we are going to keep it. The public responded very favorably and embarrassed the Democrats who brought the allegations forward, and Eisenhower, then being reassured, told him, "You're my boy." The Eisenhower-Nixon ticket defeated the Democratic candidates Adlai E. Stevenson and John Sparkman, with just under 34 million popular votes to their 27.3 million. The vote in the Electoral College was 442 to 89, respectively. Nixon served 2 terms as vice president, and he campaigned actively for Republican candidates, but he did not assume, or want to assume, significant responsibilities. He preferred not to overshadow President Eisenhower, but he did work actively behind the scenes politically. Ironically, Eisenhower, during a press conference, was asked if he could think of anything that Nixon had contributed to his administration or its policies. In response, he said, "Give me a week, I might think of one." Eisenhower suffered a series of serious illnesses between 1955 and 1957, including a heart attack, an attack of ileitis, and a stroke. While Eisenhower was incapacitated and unable to work, Nixon chaired several cabinet sessions and National Security Council meetings in his absence. Nixon learned that this select group of insiders held a real power from which he himself was never included. One of these was Air Force General Curtis E. LeMay, and others were Army Generals Matthew B. Ridgway and Omar Nelson Bradley. Ridgway stated during his interview, "Ike did not want Nixon read into anything of major national security importance. He purposely kept him in the dark, and for good reason. It was not because he did not trust him. It was in case anything we planned went wrong, then Nixon would have complete and undoubted plausible deniability, so that he could continue on later if he ran for president." After recovering from his stroke, Eisenhower realized that he had to make an adjustment. He and the cabinet formalized an agreement with Nixon on what the powers and responsibilities of the vice president would be in the event of presidential disability. This thoughtful and insightful approach was later adopted and implemented by later administrations, including the adoption of the 25th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1967. Nixon's vice presidency was also very noteworthy for his many well-publicized trips abroad, including the 1958 tour of Latin America, which was a trip described as a diplomatic Pearl Harbor by journalist Walter Lippmann. Nixon's car was stoned, struck, and spat on by anti-American protesters as tensions had been rising due to the growing expansion of the Soviet Union into the region. Tensions with the Soviet Union were at an all-time high. The Soviet Union and the United States agreed to set up national exhibitions in each other's nations in 1958 as an agreement on displays of technology and used as a cultural exchange. The Soviet exhibition opened in New York City in June 1959, while the U.S. exhibition opened in Sokoliny Park in Moscow in July. On July 24th, before the Moscow exhibition was officially opened to the public, Vice President Nixon served as a host for a visit by Soviet leader Khrushchev. Both men debated the values of their respective political and economic systems, and at times the language became quite colorful. They had their exchange in a model of an American kitchen, complete with an electric stove and oven, refrigerator, and a dishwasher. Both men discussed their respective technological developments, and Nixon explained how the average American could afford a home with these appliances, which he knew Soviet citizens had no access to. This exchange became somewhat heated, and Nixon, never one to back off from a debate, told Khrushchev that he should not be afraid of ideas. After all, you don't know everything. Khrushchev responded, "You don't know anything about communism except fear of it." Followed by reporters from several nations, the kitchen debate continued, both men raising their voices, and Nixon accusing the Soviets of wanting a nuclear war, which Khrushchev denied, stating that he just wanted peace with all nations, especially the United States. Then they had to go into a television studio for the actual official broadcast discussion. Newspapers around the world printed the event, and in the U.S., the media went crazy for several days with the explosive and apparently bloodless battle that had taken place. In 1960, Nixon received the Republican presidential nomination and was challenged by Democrat John F. Kennedy. The campaign became quite memorable for the 4 televised debates between both candidates. Despite performing quite well in his oratory and delivering competent and direct responses to the questions, he could be seen sweating heavily during the debates, which was probably from the hot lights above the podiums. However, Kennedy also displayed an ease of debate and provided very eloquent and thoughtful responses, and he presented an appealing image of youthfulness, energy, and physical poise, which convinced many that he had won the debates. The election was the closest since Grover Cleveland defeated James G. Blaine in 1884, and Nixon lost to Kennedy by fewer than 120,000 popular votes. There were concerns with the election, and many sources were citing irregularities, even voter fraud in Illinois and Texas, and many observers questioned whether Kennedy had legally won those states. Many Republicans, including Eisenhower, told Nixon to contest the results, especially after it came to light that Kennedy's father, John Kennedy, had called in a lot of markers from his old mafia underworld business associates from his days as a smuggler and bootlegger during Prohibition. One such man was mob boss Sam Giancana, who had his family secure votes from all the unions, as well as convince people to vote for Kennedy, primarily in Chicago and other cities in Illinois. There were credible accusations that many ballots had been cast by dead people, multiple people voting, and even people casting ballots who had never lived in Illinois, let alone Chicago. The Texas results were also in question, a state which, like Illinois, was no stranger to rigged elections. Lyndon B. Johnson being on the VP ticket, as well as his ability to magically locate boxes of ballots when he ran for the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, brought great scrutiny upon those results. In the end, JFK questionably won the popular vote by only 120,000 ballots, but the electoral votes gave it to Kennedy with 300 to 223. Nixon chose not to challenge the results, declaring that, "I could think of no worse example for nations abroad who, for the first time, were trying to put free electoral procedures into effect than that of the United States wrangling over the results of our presidential election, and even suggesting that the presidency itself could be stolen by thievery at the ballot box." Both supporters and critics of Nixon praised him for the dignity, decorum, and unselfishness with which he handled his defeat, and not pursuing an investigation into the suspicion that he had lost due to fraud. Following this loss, which was considered to have ended his political career, Richard Nixon announced to the press that he was retiring, telling the press in general that they would no longer have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. Nixon retired to private life back in California, where he started writing books, including his memoirs. He wrote a best-selling book, 6 Crises, published in 1961. In 1962, he was persuaded to run for governor of California, but he lost to the incumbent Democrat Edmund G. Pat Brown. After this, he moved to New York City to practice law, and over the next few years built a reputation as an expert in foreign affairs and was considered a leader who could appeal to both moderates and conservatives in the Republican Party. In 1968, Nixon was asked to run and then successfully won the Republican nomination for president in a very savvy maneuver. He created a coalition that included Southern conservatives led by Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina and others. In exchange for Southern support, Nixon promised a reciprocating quid pro quo to appoint strict constructionalists to the federal court system, to name a Southerner to the Supreme Court, to oppose court-ordered busing and school integration, and to choose a vice presidential candidate who would be acceptable to the Southern voters. Nixon chose Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew as his VP running mate, and he actively campaigned against Democrat Hubert H. Humphrey and third-party candidate Governor George Wallace of Alabama, a staunch segregationist who claimed to have changed his Democratic views on race relations. Nixon's platform included tax cut options, expanding businesses, and promising an honorable peace in and withdrawal from Vietnam, where he claimed to have a secret plan to end the war. He promised to restore law and order in the major cities that had been rocked by race riots, to crack down on illegal drugs, and an end to the draft. In a stunt that was a first for any president, and not replicated until the campaign of William Jefferson Clinton during his presidential run in 1992, Nixon used the very popular comedy show Laugh-In to get appeal to the average American in the hope of getting elected just weeks before the 1968 election. Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey was offered his opportunity to also go on the show, but he refused. Ironically, Humphrey, who was Lyndon B. Johnson's vice president, knew that the Democrat brand was heavily damaged by LBJ's unpopularity due to his Vietnam policies. Humphrey campaigned for an end to the bombing in North Vietnam as an acceptable risk for peace, long after Nixon already took that position. Johnson himself halted the bombing campaign on October 31st, less than 1 week before the election, in preparation for direct negotiations with Hanoi in the first Paris peace talks. Humphrey might have won the election, as polls showed him gaining on Nixon in the final days of the campaign, if he had made his announcement much sooner. However, Humphrey and LBJ miscalculated Nixon's well-received messaging, and he won the election by a narrow margin, 31.7 million popular votes to Humphrey's nearly 30.9 million, and the electoral vote was 301 to 191. Nixon's secret weapon to end the war was unveiled much later, and he called it his Vietnamization policy. This would see the withdrawal of all American and coalition combat troops from South Vietnam, while Congress maintained appropriations to supply the South Vietnamese with weapons. Nixon already had backdoor channels to the communists through his intermediaries. These actions were illegal under U.S. law, as he had not registered as a foreign agent, and he had no political or legal authority to make such overtures. Nixon was predicted by his opponents to be a do-nothing president, but his administration started to push a number of important reforms in welfare policy, civil rights, law enforcement, the environment, and many other areas. Nixon's proposed Family Assistance Program was intended to replace the service-oriented aid to families with dependent children, which would have provided working and non-working poor families with a guaranteed annual income, similar to welfare, although Nixon preferred to call it a negative income tax. Although this controversial measure was defeated in the U.S. Senate, the result was eventual legislation creating the Supplemental Security Income Program, which guaranteed an income to the elderly and disabled. Nixon also managed to pass automatic cost of living adjustments for Social Security recipients, which also prompted the expansion and improvement of already existing programs, such as food stamps and health insurance for low-income families. In the area of civil rights, Nixon's administration instituted the first affirmative action program ending job discrimination. Nixon also ended the long-running and rather well-hidden Tuskegee syphilis study that targeted poor black men since 1932, in a rare example of across-the-aisle cooperation. Senator Edward Kennedy called congressional hearings with Nixon's blessing. The truth was exposed when a federal funding bill surfaced that had continued funding to be entered into a bill that would have provided tax dollars for another several years to the United States Department of Health and Human Services, the Office for Human Research Protections, and Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. The actual plans for using the funding were not disclosed in the bill, but an investigation that had been launched in 1968 when William Carter Jenkins, an African-American statistician in the Public Health Service and part of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, basically blew the whistle. As a result of the hearings in 1974, as part of the settlement of a class action lawsuit filed by the NAACP on behalf of study participants and their descendants, the U.S. government paid $10 million, or $51.8 million in 2019 dollars, and agreed to provide free medical treatment to surviving participants and surviving family members infected as a consequence of the study. Congress created a commission empowered to write regulations to deter such abuses from occurring in the future. In 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act and created a commission to study and write regulations governing studies involving human participants. Within the United States Department of Health and Human Services, the Office for Human Research Protections was established to oversee clinical trials. Now, studies require informed consent, communication of diagnosis, and accurate reporting of test results. Although Nixon believed in the basic civil rights of minorities, he opposed school busing and delayed taking action on desegregation in public schools until he was forced to concede by a federal court. Nixon believed that it was a 10th Amendment issue and states should manage their own education systems. Nixon did manage to increase funding for many federal civil rights organizations and agencies, such as the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Their funding was substantially increased. Nixon himself proposed legislation that created the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency. In Part 2, we will examine Nixon's other progressive policies and then examine those greatest challenges to his presidency. Remember to check out Enlisted now on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox using this link and get your 3 days of premium time. Thanks for watching today's episode of Forgotten History. If you like this episode, please consider becoming a channel member or joining our Patreon page. This would help us offset the ever-increasing cost of production. As always, please like, share, and comment. And if you have any show ideas, please contact us, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.